We know more about what happened in Tunisia after Rome fell than we do about Britain. A desert kingdom in North Africa left us more records than an island that would eventually rule a quarter of the world. The fall of Rome wasn't one story. It was dozens of different endings. Some endings were far darker than others. Look at this map of the post-Roman world around 500 CE. Britain sits in near total historical darkness. We have almost no written records from this period. Visigothic Gaul and Spain occupy a middle ground, troubled but documented. Vandal North Africa, despite its reputation for destruction, left substantial records. The depth of Rome's original cultural imprint determined how much survived the transition. Britain experienced something close to cultural erasure. North Africa merely changed management. Let's examine this spectrum, starting with the Vandals, the aggressive option. By the mid-5th century, they controlled Tunisia and eastern Algeria from their capital at Carthage. They actively persecuted Roman elites and Catholic bishops. But here's what's striking. The Vandals weren't incompetent. They maintained an effective navy, the only barbarian group to do so. They plundered Rome itself multiple times, sailing across the Mediterranean to sack the Eternal City. Military effectiveness and structural stability are different things. The Vandals had the first, but lacked the second. The Visigoths represent our middle ground. They kicked off the whole era with incursions into the Balkans in the late 4th century. By 410, they sacked Rome, the event that shocked the ancient world. Over the following decades, they migrated westward, eventually controlling most of southern France. By 506. They were expanding into Spain simultaneously. Unlike the Vandals, the Visigoths pursued accommodation rather than persecution. They worked with Roman elites, adopted Roman administrative practices, and tried to maintain existing structures. But pressure from the Franks would eventually push them entirely into Spain. Britain represents the extreme case and the mystery. Rome withdrew its last troops in the 440s, fearing Gaul would fall next and needing every soldier. What followed was closer to conventional conquest than gradual accommodation. Anglo-Saxon groups didn't negotiate with Roman elites. There weren't many to negotiate with. Here's the critical insight. Rome's imprint on Britain was lighter than anywhere else. The population remained majority Celtic, not Romanized. When the Anglo-Saxons arrived, they encountered a thin Roman veneer over a Celtic foundation. The result? The past was largely obliterated. Very little Latin was being written. The Celtic population either blended with the newcomers or retreated west, becoming the ancestors of the Welsh and Scots. Despite their differences, all these barbarian kingdoms shared the same fatal weaknesses. 4 structural problems plagued every successor state. First, administrative disorganization. These groups couldn't maintain Roman bureaucracy, the tax collection, the legal systems, the infrastructure management. Second, internecine feuds, constant internal warfare, drained resources and destabilized leadership. Third, religious conflict. Most barbarian groups practiced Arian Christianity, a form Rome considered heretical. This created instant tension with the Catholic Roman population they ruled. Fourth, economic dysfunction. They could plunder effectively but couldn't produce. Wealth extraction without wealth creation is a death spiral. The Vandal collapse illustrates these weaknesses perfectly. Despite their navy, despite their aggression, despite controlling wealthy North African grain lands, the Vandals were obliterated by Byzantine reconquest in the early 530s. By 506, they were already shrinking. Moorish groups, native desert peoples who had lived at Rome's edges, were reclaiming former Roman territories. The same structural weaknesses that plagued all barbarian kingdoms caught up with them. Military power without administrative capacity is temporary. Britain's historical silence now makes sense. The mystery isn't really mysterious, it's structural. Very little Latin was being written because very few people wrote Latin. The Roman administrative class that kept records elsewhere barely existed in Britain. The Celtic population had their own traditions, but these were oral, not written. When the Anglo-Saxons arrived, they brought their own oral culture. Written history requires writers. Britain had almost none. This wasn't just political change, it was cultural erasure. This spectrum gives us a framework for understanding any civilizational transition. 3 diagnostic questions matter. First, how deep was the original cultural imprint? Britain's thin Roman veneer couldn't survive disruption. North Africa's deep Romanization persisted through Vandal rule. Second, was the transition accommodation or conquest? The Visigoths negotiated, the Anglo-Saxons replaced. Third, what structural weaknesses did the successor state inherit or create? All barbarian kingdoms shared administrative, religious, and economic dysfunction. The answers to these questions determine whether a civilization falls or transforms. And this is why historians argue about whether Rome fell or transformed. The answer depends entirely on where you're standing. A Roman in Britain experienced apocalypse, their entire world erased within generations. A Roman in parts of Italy barely noticed the change in management. Same empire, same century, completely different experiences. The fall of Rome wasn't an event, it was a spectrum of transitions shaped by how deeply Rome had planted its roots and how the newcomers chose to govern. Some places transformed, some places died, most fell somewhere in between. The Franks would eventually prove the exception to barbarian fragility. They solved the religious problem by converting to Catholic Christianity. They built administrative capacity rather than just inheriting it. They created something durable where others created only chaos. But that transformation from barbarian kingdom to medieval powerhouse is another story.